Okay, now we're going to talk on the mitochondrion. Plural would be mitochondria. The mitochondrion is the powerhouse for the cell. It's the it's the organelle that produced the most ATP. The other portion of the cell, the cytoplasm, can produce some, but the mitochondrion produces the majority. It's an organelle that's about 0.5 to 10 micrometers. It's primarily for the powerhouse of the cell, but it does do some other things too, you can see. Now in medicine, we are finding that when a person has a loss of energy or other things, sometimes it can be mitochondrial disease. Let's go a little further, you'll see what I'm saying. The mitochondria in nearly all eukaryotic cells, okay? Plant cells use something called chloroplast. The construct of the mitochondria, which is the cristae and mitochondrial matrix, let's look at a picture. The mitochondria has two membranes. Now, these membranes are not at all like anything in the cell, because you'll see in a moment the mitochondrion have their own DNA and RNA. Okay, but let's look at the construct. You have an outer membrane and an inner membrane. Then you have a space between the two called the intermembrane space between the outer membrane and the inner membrane. The inner membrane has some projections to increase surface area called cristae. There's some liquid stuff inside the mitochondria, inside that they call the matrix. So that's the construct that you can see. The cristae, smooth inward foldings, mitochondrial matrix, and so forth. Okay, let's go a little further. The mitochondrion has its own DNA and RNA, separate from the nucleus. It has only a few genes, around 37 total genes. Around 37. Now here's where it probably came from. Since the mitochondria contains a type of DNA similar to bacterial DNA, it appears that the mitochondria evolved from bacteria and once was a lineage of its own. What am I basically saying? It's called the endosymbiotic theory. It is believed that the mitochondrion was developing to be a cell of itself, most likely a bacteria. That particular entity, had tremendous talent at generating energy. Then you had this other cell that was developing that could do a lot of stuff, but wasn't good at developing energy. Some kind of way, the larger cell engulfed the smaller one. Kind of like a acquisition in corporate world, where one big company will buy another one. The reason they buy the other one, it has an advantage. So the mitochondrion supplies the energy to the cell supplies some, and that's how we believe it happened. Because the mitochondrion was developing as a cell to itself, it had its own DNA and RNA, and it kept it. But if a big company buys a small one and you still keep all the CEOs, the small company might try to take over the big one. So part of the processes of the mitochondrion to replicate depend on its own genes, but it does require some of the nuclear genes in order to complete it. That way, the big cell, should we say the cell itself, still has power and control over the mitochondrion. Mitochondrial chromosomes have far fewer genes than bacteria, which are thought to be described. Okay? Mitochondria divide in response to energy needs of the cell. What does that mean? If you start doing endurance training, like running, swimming, you can increase the number of mitochondria inside the cell to get more energy without the cell dividing, because the mitochondria has its own DNA. The only thing, doing fertilization, the man brings sperm, the lady brings the egg. In the egg is the mitochondria. So Mitochondrial DNA is from the mom. Mitochondrial DNA, because the only thing the sperm brings is genetic material. So if we analyze we want to analyze maternal DNA, we could look at the mitochondria, and then we will only have the mother's side. Here again is a picture of the mitochondria. Outer membrane, inner membrane space. As I alluded to, this membrane is different than the cell membrane because it's working off a different DNA. Okay? Now, how does the mitochondrion work? This is really more of a subject for ANP2, but I'm going to give you some now because we need it in muscle. You eat your foods, your proteins, your carbohydrates, your fats. We're going to do the carbohydrates primarily. The carbohydrates then will be broken down and we'll get glucose. Inside the cytoplasm of the cell, not the mitochondria, you have a process that has about 10 steps called glycolysis. Glycolysis takes glucose and changes it several times into pyruvic acid. That's inside the cytoplasm. Then, inside the mitochondria, you have enzymes that can take pyruvic acid. You'll move inside the mitochondria, and you have two processes going on inside the mitochondria to produce ATP. Something called the Krebs cycle and something called the electron transport chain. Something called the Krebs cycle and something called the electron transport chain. Okay. So basically, I'm going to go to this picture. So glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm of the cell. Glycolysis only produces a few ATPs, generally around a net of 2 ATPs. If, however, oxygen is available, now this is the key to the mitochondria, listen to me well. To be able to utilize the activities of the mitochondria, the cell must be able to get a sufficient supply of oxygen. A sufficient supply of oxygen. And if you do, then the pyruvic acid from glycolysis. Now, glycolysis doesn't need oxygen. It's anaerobic. Anaerobic means without oxygen. The mitochondria's aerobic work. It needs oxygen. The anaerobic work will only produce about 2 ATPs. So you'll get some, but not much. But if you have oxygen, you'll still go through these first 10 steps. And then this chemical, if you have oxygen, can enter into the mitochondrion, and do the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle then hands some material, some what we call electrons, to the electron transport chain. So inside the mitochondria, you have this process and that process. Ultimately, if everything goes right, you could get about 32 ATPs, but you got to have oxygen. So the mitochondrion is producing the lion's share of the ATPs. But what's the requirement? You got to have oxygen. What's the requirement? You got to have oxygen. Since again the mitochondria has its own DNA, when you start endurance training, you will start to increase the amount of mitochondria in the cell. Now, when you stop doing it for a while, then you'll decrease it. Well, how do you get rid of these so they just don't degenerate and mess up the cell? That's where the lysosomes. Remember, autophagy was to take out organelles you no longer needed. So you can increase these if you need them and decrease them if you don't. Here, I just showed you glycolysis. You don't have to really learn it, but you can see these 10 steps of conversion, ending with pyruvate, just to show you. Then, the pyruvate can enter into here if oxygen is available. If O2 is not available, then the pyruvate cannot enter, but it'll transfer to something, And that's when you start getting lactic acid, that burn in the muscle. So the pyruvate is going to change into something. If oxygen, it'll go in to the Krebs cycle. If no oxygen, you'll become lactate, lactic acid, and you'll get that burn. So here's again another one. Glucose glycolysis, cytoplasm. Then pyruvate. No oxygen, lactate, painful. Oxygen, O2, it goes in here and can really generate some ATPs. This right here is the Krebs cycle. See, in that Krebs cycle, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, you have 8 steps in here. But for those 8 steps, you're generating 32 ATPs. Whereas in this one, you had 10 steps and you only generated 2. So that's why aerobic metabolism gives you more energy than anaerobic metabolism. Okay? So when it comes to carbohydrate, this would be glucose, you may recall. That's glucose. Then you combine it with oxygen, and this is what you come out, a total of 36 ATPs. 2 in glycolysis, 32 in the Krebs, and then 2 in a step between the glycolysis and the Krebs, when pyruvate is converted to acetyl-CoA. Glucose is catabolized in 3 glycolysis, Krebs, electron transport chain. So again, we go back to this. Now I started with carb, but the other things too go through, they just enter the cycle at different points, the fats, to give you ATP. The electron transport chain pulls electrons, and the final receiver is oxygen. That's why you need that oxygen. Oxygen is highly electronegative, and it pulls these electrons from your food. It pulls these electrons from your food, and each time the electrons move, they generate energy. Remember what I told you. Energy is the capability to do work. Work is a force times distance. So energy, you have to move something. So you can kind of read on it. Don't get heavy on it, because this is just to kind of give you an understanding of how that mitochondrion works. Here's that electron transport chain. This is in the membrane of the mitochondrion, and these are little features in it. I'm not going to get into that, but that shows you these electrons are being pulled along the way that you have. All right, there's another picture there. All right, we'll close there. That kind of gives you an understanding of the mitochondrion. I gave you a little bit of metabolism so you could kind of see the importance of the mitochondrion. Key issues on the mitochondrion. Number 1, your mom passed it on to you, not the dad. The mitochondrion has an outer membrane, inner membrane space. The inner membrane has cristae, which increase surface area. The surface area is to put all those enzymes on to do the Krebs cycle and everything. The matrix is in the middle. The mitochondria can increase because it has its own DNA and RNA without the cell increasing. If it increases, it would increase because of aerobic exercise, not necessarily lifting weights, because that's anaerobic. When you don't need it anymore, if you, for example, stop exercising, then it will then lysosomes will take it out. So those are the keys to everything. It has only about 37 genes, not many. It cannot divide. His genes cannot do it all. So the mitochondrion still has to get permission through a few genes from the nucleus to divide. Right? So that gives you a review and an introduction to the mitochondrion. So our next subject will be the cytoskeleton in another video.